followed him for 3 years, watching, learning, trying to decipher his messages. He touched those who were deemed untouchable. He looked at those who went unseen by others. He taught us to love everyone. Everyone. Beggars, lepers, women, children, tax collectors, Gentiles, and even Samaritans. There was something different about him on Thursday at our Passover meal. I felt like he was trying to tell us something that was very important, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. Then in Gethsemane, everything fell apart. The soldiers had come for him and maybe for all of us. I ran, and so did most of the others. And as morning came, we watched from a distance as Jesus was crucified. And through Saturday, we sat in a locked room, devastated, numb with grief, and afraid for our own lives. Then Sunday, we started to hear reports that the tomb was empty. But what did that mean? Who did this? Would the Romans accuse us? The others stayed inside, but I had to get out. And when I returned later that evening, everything had changed. The disciples told me that Jesus had risen and that he had just appeared to them moments before. I couldn't believe it. I told them I wouldn't believe it until I saw it for myself. I wanted to believe, but my mind said impossible, and if it really were true, I was hurt at the thought that he would appear to them when I wasn't there. Surely he knew I wasn't there. Why would he appear to them when I was away? Did he love me any less? Did he not care about me? In my doubt, I missed out on the joy of the moment. I missed out on the celebration of the risen Christ. But I wasn't forgotten. Jesus appeared again when I was there. He looked at me, he showed me his wounds, and he proved beyond any doubt that it was him. It was him, and I will never doubt again.
So we're talking this morning about doubting Thomas. Wouldn't you hate to be Thomas? What if each one of us were required to have an adjective before our first name? It's a scary thought, isn't it? Something especially that might speak to one particular moment in our life that if we could go do it all over again, we'd do it differently. And yet that's, anytime we hear the name Thomas, oh yeah, doubting Thomas. You know, there is more to his life than that one event. A week or two ago, just happened to be chatting with Carol Joyce as she was in her office, chatting about some things, and I guess she was asking about kids' church because she's teaching it this morning, and I said, yeah, we're going to be talking about Thomas. And she said, oh, I just heard this message on the radio from Chuck Swindoll about Thomas. And she's sharing some things, and she's not even here this morning since she's in children's church. Some of what we talked about is working its way into these thoughts here this morning. Aside from being named in some various lists of the disciples, there's really just two other times where we see Thomas say something in the Gospels. They're all in the Gospel of John. The first one is in John chapter 11. Doesn't exactly sound like the words of someone who is weak in faith. Some of you may know John 11. Oh yeah, that's the Lazarus story. You say, really? Expect any of us to know that? Well, okay. John 11 is the story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus. As you know some of that story, Jesus was not there when Lazarus was sick. He was some distance away, and a messenger came to Jesus and told him that the one you love is sick. And we read in verse 4, when Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." The next verse, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And we're scratching our heads. The disciples are wondering what's going on. Then after those 2 days, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." They say, "But Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there?" And Jesus answers that with kind of a riddle. And then the next verse, after he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to wake him up." And of course, we read that from knowing the end of the story, and we say, "Oh, this is so cool, see how he's given them these little hints, and they're clueless." Verse 12, his disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." I mean, that's a good sign. If someone's finally resting, it's like, okay, maybe the fever's gone, maybe the pain's gone, maybe whatever it is, they're finally sleeping. They say, if he sleeps, then that means he'll get better. And John tells us Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But now let us go to him." It's at this point that Thomas speaks up. Thomas, who I believe is feeling all of this whiplash, this what's going on here, and he says to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." First of all, whatever he's talking about, it doesn't sound like a skeptic, doubter. It doesn't sound like someone who's not sure whether he's in or not, does it? I mean, this sounds like someone who's in with 2 feet up to his neck. There's no question about his faith. There's no question about his friendship, his loyalty. Let's go. We'll die with him. Now, it still is a little perplexing, and I spent some time on this again this week, and I think what's probably happening is, did you hear what Jesus said? Jesus said clearly, no more riddles, no more softening it and talk about sleep instead of death. He said, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you may believe, but now let us go to him." Where is Lazarus? He's in death. And Jesus says, "Let's go to him." All right, I'm in. Let's all go. Let's go with him so we can go to Lazarus too. And the only thing that made sense, I believe, to Thomas is Lazarus is in death. He's not here anymore. He's died. Wherever he is, Jesus says we're going to go to him. Let's go. I mean, it still maybe isn't satisfying to really understand, boy, that's a little strange. But whether you agree with me or not on that, bottom line is, here's Thomas not dragging his feet. Here's Thomas leading the pack to say, wherever you go, we're going. And if it means death, we'll die with him. I'm in. It's a little different Thomas, isn't it, than we're used to thinking. Well, you know how the story ends. That's the extent of it as far as Thomas is concerned. They do go, and Lazarus, by the time they get there, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days, and Jesus calls him to life again. Fast forward a couple chapters, chapter 14. right after the Last Supper. Jesus has predicted that one of them would betray him. He's predicted that all of them would desert him. He says to them, the end of chapter 13, after the supper, he says, my little children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. And then he says, I'm giving you a new commandment, and this is going to sustain you during this time when I'm gone from you. Love one another as I have loved you. You must love one another. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. The most important thing I can tell you to prepare for my being gone is to love one another. Peter misses all of that and says, Lord, where are you going? Jesus says, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. I think I see what he's doing there. Peter says, well, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And that's where Jesus says, will you really? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And my guess is that not only hit Peter like a ton of bricks, but I think it reverberated around the others. Remember, Judas has already departed. The very next verse, remember that John didn't put in these chapter divisions. The original manuscripts didn't have these numbers. They're for our convenience. Right after Jesus said, in John's record here, right after the words to Peter, you're going to deny me. The rooster's going to crow 3 times. Interesting, he says it's going to happen before the rooster crows. You'll deny me 3 times. Remember, this is Thursday evening. When's the rooster going to crow next? Friday morning. Basically saying before morning gets here, this is going to happen. Can imagine this silence. And then Jesus speaks these words, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. And I'm putting this parenthesis in here. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this much. In my Father's house are many rooms. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me so that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. And you're one of the disciples. And what are you thinking? I'm not sure I do. I'm not sure I really know where he's going, and I know I don't know the way, and yet he just said so clearly and so confidently, you know the way to the place. Excuse me, let me get this right. You know, yes, the way to the place where I am going. Okay, who's going to be the first? Are you willing to be the first one to say, I don't? Who is it who speaks up? It's Thomas. You might say, well, it's kind of, his question is he's contradicting Jesus. But listen, understand the context. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? I want to suggest that's not the question of one who's standing on the sidelines trying to decide whether to get in the game or not. That's the question of a man who's all in. but whose mind is going in so many different directions, whose heart is perhaps starting to be torn in half, who desperately wants something to hold on to, and these words about going to prepare a place and coming again and bringing you to be with me are words of hope. And then he says, and you know the way to the place. And Thomas is saying, no, I don't. And I'm not about to miss the opportunity to find out before it's too late. And Thomas speaks up. And he gives the question to the answer. And you know what the answer is? I am the way, the truth, and the life. The way to the Father is through me. All right, so there's a little bit more to this Thomas than we realized. I want to suggest 3 lessons that we can take with us from his life. Number 1 is what I just said. Number 1 is there is more to each of us than who we are at our weakest moment. Does anyone feel like saying, praise the Lord? Let me say this again. There is more to each of us than who we are at our weakest moment. And we can chuckle, but I hope we feel that deeply. There was more to Thomas. There's more to us. Secondly, say, oh, cool, these are moving pretty fast. Secondly, it is okay to speak up and express doubts and ask questions. Yes, you heard me right. It is okay to speak up and express doubts and ask questions. Even in church, it's okay. Especially when motivated by deep caring. Doubts and questions are not always a reflection of contempt or hostility or unbelief. They're simply doubts and questions that we all have in different ways and at different times. And it's okay to speak up and to express them. Sometimes, like in John 14, the question or the thing that we want to ask is the same thing everyone else is wanting to ask too, but are afraid to ask. Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? It's okay to speak up and express doubts and ask questions. That's much better than living in confusion and uncertainty. And it is much better than a weak indifference. Do you hear that? Expressing doubts, expressing questions is much better than a weak indifference. I'm not judging the other disciples. I'm putting it in perspective. All of Thomas, including his doubts. That's true about life in general. It's true about what we do here. I'm going to say it's true about what we're specifically focusing on at this point in our journey together. It's true about our consultation process. I would rather hear your doubts and your questions than have you be weakly indifferent. Does that fit? Absolutely it does. I would rather have doubts and questions that come from a position of I'm all in and I care than to have just quiet going along, not really invested. I considered a slightly different sermon title this morning. I started with From Doubt to Faith. And I changed it slightly. I hear all this rattling as you're looking to see what it changed to. I changed it to through doubt to faith. Does it make a difference? Seen some say, yeah, it does. Doubt is not just a place to move away from. Doubt sometimes is part of the process that God uses. It's an important part of the journey. Our questions are an important part of the journey. And so I believe the journey to faith is often through doubt, not just from doubt. I want to encourage us with that. Number one, there's more to each of us than who we are at our weakest moment. Two, it's okay to speak up and express doubts or ask questions. Number three, it's commendable to exercise trust beyond what we can see, especially in those we have known to be trustworthy. What did Jesus say? He didn't rebuke Thomas. He met him where he was. He spoke to him. He engaged him. He invited him to see, to put his hands, to touch his hands, put his fingers in the wounds, to show him his side. And he did say, don't be doubtful. Believe. But then he went on to say, you have seen and now you believe, but blessed are those who have not seen and still choose to believe. It is possible to exercise trust beyond what we can see. You say, well, you're contradicting. No. It's okay to doubt and ask questions from a position of interest, of passion, of trying to sort things out. That's okay, but it's also possible while we're trying to work through our doubts and while we're asking our questions to remember that it's also possible Jesus actually commended and called it blessed when we get to a point where we don't have all the answers. It is possible, it is commendable to exercise trust beyond what we're able to see. To do our due diligence, to try to get answers where we can, and at some point to say, okay, I'm going to trust for the rest. I'm going to trust until God shows me more. I'm going to continue to follow. I'm all in. Maybe we could give Thomas a different name. Engaged Thomas. Passionate Thomas. Thomas pursuing conviction. All in Thomas. What words describe us? I hope it would be some of those as well.